This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, publishers of the book Boom to Bust: How Streaming Broke Hollywood Writers by Miranda Banks and Kate Fort-Mueller. Hollywood workers are in crisis. This book, written by two media industry experts, captures the lived experiences of workers struggling in a new Hollywood marked by disruptions and strikes. Providing a roadmap to make sense of Hollywood's present, this book looks at the complex issues that come next. Learn more about Boom to Bust at UCPress.edu. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the first episode of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Nusantara is a word that refers to the vast geographic archipelago that only through centuries of colonial capitalism and the struggles against it became a nation, one whose boundaries, identities, and purpose remain contested to this day. I've long been planning to do a series on the history of Indonesia. It's the fourth largest country, home to the world's largest Muslim population, and it once boasted the largest communist party outside the Soviet Union and China. In 1965, the Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI, was wiped out in a mass U.S.-backed military-led genocide that killed between 500,000 and 1 million people. That horrific episode is now far more widely known thanks to Joshua Oppenheimer's 2012 documentary film The Act of Killing and Vincent Bevin's book The Jakarta Method. And yet, in the West, Indonesia remains, I would argue, the least understood country on Earth per capita. A giant country that most of us know almost nothing about. This is an important story for the global left to understand. It's a story that begins at the dawn of European capitalist colonialism. First, briefly with the Portuguese, and then, for hundreds of years, under the Dutch. The Dutch East Indies and the wealth violently plundered from it were central to making colonial capitalist modernity. The revolution against Dutch colonialists launched in 1945, led by various nationalist, Islamist, and communist groupings, then set the pace for decolonization struggles worldwide. Those Indonesian political currents, as we'll discuss throughout the series, came into repeated, bloody conflict. When Indonesian President Sukarno hosted the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference in 1955, it marked the first global convergence of colonized people of its type and scale. And it took place in Bandung, Indonesia, because Indonesia was at the vanguard of those global struggles. The reaction against those struggles across the Third World was often quite brutal. In Indonesia, the mass murder of communists in 1965 was led by a military officer named Suharto as he staged a coup against Sukarno. The U.S.-backed genocide put an end to Indonesia's radical political tradition, and Marxism, communism, and socialism remain illegal in Indonesia today, even after the 1998 return to democracy. That return to democracy left the country's military and oligarchic order largely intact, and much of its ugly history actively repressed. Indonesia is now ruled by President Prabowo Subijanto, the dictator Suharto's former son-in-law, and the author of bloody atrocities during Indonesia's 1970s and 80s dirty war against the East Timor independence movement, as well as the kidnapping of activists in 1998. Before we get any further, I highly recommend that you hit pause and spend a few minutes exploring a map of Indonesia. The country contains somewhere between 13,000 and 17,000 islands. Maybe. It's really unclear and hotly debated. Nearly 1,000 of those islands, perhaps, are permanently inhabited. Java is the fertile population center. Bali sits just to its east. So does West and East Nusantara and West Timor. To its northwest is the large island of Sumatra. Farther northeast are Borneo, also known as Kalimantan, Sulawesi, the Moluccas, or the so-called Spice Islands, West Papua, and so many more. Again, hit pause. Familiarize yourself with the map. We decided on the word Nusantara because no place called Indonesia existed when our story began. Indeed, the word Indonesia was coined in the mid-19th century by a British ethnologist from the Greek words for Indian and islands, Indos and Nessos. When the Portuguese and Dutch arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, countless different polities existed under distinct group identities and forms of sovereignty, often connected to one another by complex trade routes that connected the region to China, India, the Arab world, and beyond. There were sultanates in inland Java and in Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra, the Hindu aristocracy on Bali, and the hunter-gatherers in parts of Kalimantan and Papua. Powerful trading city-states on the Malay Peninsula were a fundamental part of this world. They only ended up in present-day Malaysia because the British conquered some territories while the Dutch conquered others. Here, as elsewhere across the post-colonial world, the boundaries of present-day nation-states were made by the contingencies of colonialism. The same could be said about Spanish colonialism in what is today the Philippines. There's no clear line that one can retrospectively draw between what is today Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, even Cambodia. This installment, Episode 1, traces Indonesian history from the arrival of the Portuguese in the early 16th century and then the Dutch in the early 17th. European powers that used military force to dominate the region's lucrative spice trade. While the Portuguese attempted to dominate trade routes, their Dutch successors attempted to fully control trade in key commodities like nutmeg and clove, quickly resorting to genocide to get their way. This was a mercantile form of capitalist colonialism carried out by one of the world's first two joint stock companies, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. The VOC wasn't interested in directly governing indigenous territory. Instead, it would overthrow recalcitrant rulers and put pliant ones on the throne when necessary. And yet, still, major regional powers remained beyond their control. That began to change in the 18th century, as wars of succession on Java drew the Dutch deeper into more direct forms of governance. Then, at the dawn of the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe shifted control of colonial operations in the East Indies to the French and then to the British, which both pursued a profound modernization of the colonial state. In 1815, the Dutch returned to power and began to directly govern and build out the modern Dutch East Indies. After retaking control from the French and British, the Dutch fought a massively bloody war to put down a rebellion on Java called the Java War and consolidated their control. In 1830, they instituted a regime of forced labor known as the cultivation system. Over the rest of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Dutch then expanded direct rule across the archipelago, fighting a series of brutal wars, using a new colonial army, in substantial part made up of colonized minorities, to conquer Sumatra, Bali, and other outer islands. In the late 19th century, the liberal period began, replacing the cultivation system with an economy wide open to direct capitalist investment. Outright slavery had been abolished, but racist colonial domination was now supplemented with market discipline and a massive infusion of capital. capitalist and colonial state power then presided over a widespread process of proletarianization as peasants migrated to work on plantations alongside semi-enslaved coolie indentured servants. Finally, the ethical period, inaugurated at the turn of the 20th century, brought a new humanitarian face to the colonial enterprise, modestly expanding education and healthcare and creating a new class of lower-rank colonial administrators known as the lesser priai. That social layer, as we'll discuss in the next episode, would form the leadership class of the nationalist, Islamist, and communist movements that erupted over the first decades of the 20th century. Indeed, this social layer would invent the very concept of Indonesia to encompass the vast human diversity of the archipelago into one nation with one flag, one anthem, and a shared national language. I'll be conducting this series with a few different guests, starting this first episode with scholars Rianne Subijanto and Mada Supriatma. Later on in the series, we'll be joined by Farabi Faki and Ikra Anugrah. Before we get started, one term that gets used a few times in this episode without being defined, I think, that I want to point out here, adat, which means customary law. And also, I'll be doing my best to pronounce words and names correctly, but I will no doubt frequently mess up. Thanks for your understanding. In other news, the illegal U.S.-Israeli war of aggression on Iran and on Lebanon rages on as the Trump administration asphyxiates the Cuban economy and the people who depend upon it. I'll be recording an episode probably for next week on geoeconomic warfare. Stay tuned. And our archives at thedigradio.com include multi-part series on the history of Iran, the history of the Arab East, and on MAGA imperialism, all of which will help you make sense of this present moment. Lastly, please support The Dig at patreon.com/thedig. As I think you know, this is a very hard-working podcast. Where else can you find this level of analysis of everything, everywhere? What's more, we put everything we make out for free, with no paywall. This is a political education project. Our goal is for the maximum number of people to listen to every single episode so that the left everywhere is armed with the information and knowledge they need to transform the world. That's what your voluntary contribution makes possible. And so, if you can afford to make a monthly or annual donation, please take a moment to do so. That's patreon.com/thedig. There's a link in the show notes. Please click it. Okay, here's Rianne Subijanto and Mada Supriatma for episode 1 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College in the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She's also an editor for the Indonesian left media, indoprogress.com. Mada Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Anne Subijanto and Made Supriatma. Welcome to The Dig.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dan.
Before we get into the way back into the early 16th century, I think we should start this series with a big picture question. Why are we doing this series? Why do we need to understand Indonesian history, us on the global left? Why then is Indonesia and its history so little understood in the West, particularly given both how decisively the history of Indonesia was shaped by the West, by Western colonialism, and how much in turn it was pillaged Indonesian riches that built the wealth of the modern West. Anne.
So, the narrative of capitalism as it is told from a Eurocentric perspective, it's usually in terms of transition, and it's about how capitalism emerged from Europe and then expanded to the world. And so when formal colonialism ended in 1945 or 1949 in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, it seems that actually it was a successful story because Indonesia now became an independent country and now it was integrated into the global capitalist system, right? So it's a success story for Indonesia, but also a success story for the Dutch, because now they also have helped the Indonesia to go through the transition and become a capitalist country. So because it fit the narrative of capitalism that began in Europe, that narrative actually was never dismantled. That narrative was actually a part of the fact that colonialism itself continued to exist until today in a form of the so-called coloniality, right? So the formal colonialism ended, but not colonial, structures of unequal relationship, etc. So that's one way of seeing it. Another way of seeing it is that the Dutch, unlike the British and the French, they never actually taught or educated or included education and language education as part of their colonial system. So the Indonesian themselves, they didn't actually know Dutch, much of them, except for if you were the elite class. So by the time the Dutch ended their colonialism, there was that abrupt cut in which then the Indonesians were occupied in nation building and really got rid of anything Dutch, right? So there is this disconnect with the previous centuries of colonialism, and there was not really also a practice of, except for in the history department in Indonesia or some study center like Southeast Asia centers in some pockets, including in KITLV, for example, in Leiden, in the Netherlands. Apart from all of those, the study of Indonesian colonialism was never a part of the nation building of Indonesia or a part of the Dutch in its memory. Now, lastly, and most importantly, in my view, is that if you look at the evolution of global capitalism, the Dutch power itself also diminished, especially at the turn of 20th century with the rise of the US American empire. And, so this Anglo-centric center of knowledge production did not include this already, like the Dutch that is put in the corner. And also, of course, Indonesia that was not really tied so closely to the Netherlands, right, as a part of its nation building. So the geopolitical of the 20th and also I would suggest 21st century created this absence. So for your second question, why should we in the global left study Indonesia? Well, actually, because it is important to study Indonesia because Indonesia has been integral and essential as a part of the building of global capitalism since the very beginning, since very early. When European set their sail on a voyage, to start their expedition, aka colonialism, Indonesia was their goals, and we can expand that later in our conversation. So, in order for us to understand capitalism, we need to study Indonesia because it's so integral to the global capitalist system, right? It fueled it, through their land, labor, and their sweat. And most importantly, also Indonesia was one of the oldest and largest anti-colonial and anti-capitalist movement in the 20th century. It led that up until the killing of the communists in 1965.
Made.
Yeah, I think why Indonesia were ignored by the West is just because of the Dutch. Yeah, such a tiny country, the Dutch has no military might, just unlike the British or the French. So it brings a different kind of colonialism to Indonesia, not through military subjugation, but I think it's more by a contract by local rulers everywhere in the archipelago. That's the first thing that they are doing, and also we have to remember that the Dutch first set up the company, the VOC, which is become later on become very very rich company. It's not the state, but this is a company with the military, the contract soldiers from everywhere from the Europe come to the archipelago, and then after that making a deal, securing monopolies for commodities, something like that, and then after they built a sort of Netherlands East Indies, which is consolidated at the second half of the 19th century. They're still doing the similar practices, short-term contract, long-term contract, and also become very, very paternalistic. You see the pictures, the very famous pictures of King of Solo, which is in the Central Java, becomes what's it, the little brothers of the Dutch resident. It's just a resident level. So these kind of things happen in all over archipelago. So there's a vacuum, I think, the Dutch not introducing its colony enough to the Europe, and then the rest of the world that don't care about Indonesia. So that's why. So, but at the same time, I think it's also a fortune for Indonesia because it can grow its own nationalism. Indonesia is, as MacLean said, that's an improbable nation. So unlikely nations. You can just by any means 17,000 ethnic groups, hundreds of languages, and yet it's still thinking that they are Indonesian. This is a very very new concept. It's not exist in the 19th century. It's come up in 20th century, and also the term Indonesia itself is not coming from the local language. That's somebody out there. I think the Britons call it Indonesia, and then we pick it up and make it as our pride right now. But at the same time, yeah, I agree with Anne that we have the freedom to shape our nationalism, to shape our movement, and also later on, because of the geopolitics development in the 50s and the 60s, it has to clash with the geopolitical interests of a new power, especially the American one. And then we have to cross our own movement, our own nationalist movement.
And just to point out a concrete example of how improbable it is that these thousands of ethno-linguistic groups come to share one national identity. You both are from different ethno-linguistic groups from different islands entirely.
Yeah, I'm a Balinese, so
yes, and I'm a mix. I'm from Java, Central Java, and also a mix of Central Java, different regions. And then my mom is from Sumatra in Lampung.
Yeah. Let's turn back the clock a few centuries, starting with a lesson in early 16th century geography, physical, social, economic, political geography, just to explain a bit more this vast array of peoples and polities that made up what would only hundreds of years later become Indonesia. The Dutch fully colonized the archipelago in the 19th and early 20th century, making it the Dutch East Indies. But it was the Portuguese who first, in the 16th century, they were the first European power to conquer territory in the region when, in 1511, they took the powerful Malay trading state of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula in present-day Malaysia, the northern shores of the Straits of Malacca. But before we get there, what sort of polities controlled the various territories and what would again only become a nation called Indonesia when 20th century nationalists adopted that name? It's just too vast an array of polities and peoples to comprehensively describe here. But at a more general level, lay it out. The interior of Java, the powerful Hindu-Buddhist kingdom of Majapahit, and then later the Islamic Sultanate of Mataram. And again, there's Malacca, which rose to wealth and power, controlling this key juncture in these important trade routes connecting India, Persia, the Mediterranean, over to the Spice Islands of Maluku, and at the end of the archipelago and onto China, and then on the far upper tip, back west of the island of Sumatra, the powerful, wealthy Sultanate of Aceh. Elsewhere, various, many different hunter-gatherer societies, at the time absolutely indifferent to the world system emerging around them. What was, and this feels almost impossible to describe, what was the extant regional order, and what were the trade routes that were circulating these natural resources, sandalwood, gold, clove, nutmeg, textiles, that the Portuguese and then Dutch encountered when they arrived in the 16th century?
Yeah, I think at first there's two, what we so-called right now, India and China. That's the most powerful power in the region at the time. India, because of this the trade routes from the archipelago, what we call it right now, Nusantara, actually. This is a new popularized term not to refer to the state, but to the area of this archipelago, the Nusantara. So from here to India and also from China, especially Indonesia, right now what we call Indonesia, very influenced by the China. What happened in China, Imperium over there. I think we have a term for that. The novelist, Indonesian greatest novelist, Pramudia Anantatur, depict it as negeri atas angin, the above the wind, and India as the negeri bawah angin, country below the wind. That's two most powerful imperial power that they take turns to influence the regions. And the regions, I think, at first, it has so many central power. Yeah. And the biggest one, I think, before Majapahit, there is Sriwijaya. That's a Buddhist kingdom in Sumatra. It's very powerful. I think its power goes across, now we call it Cambodia, Champa, and also near Vietnam. And the second things after this, the collapse of Sriwijaya Empire, we have another empire, we call it Majapahit, located in East Java during that time. And then after that came Islam, slowly. First Islam become the religion of the elites because of the trade with the traders, especially from Gujarat, India. There's a lot of Muslim traders coming into in Java and other regions. And also it depends on commodity. In Maluku, you have the cloves and nutmeg. Yeah, that's the center. That's what the Portuguese came for. Also, that's what the Spanish also for a brief period of time coming for Maluku for nutmeg. But then after they can cultivate these commodities outside this archipelago, especially in Zanzibar, so they don't need again to look for cloves to Maluku because it's too far away. Zanzibar is closer to Middle Eastern and closer to Europe. And also, but there's a lot of communities like the Banjarmasin kingdom, very famous for pepper. Bantam, right now, Banten is also very famous for pepper. And sandalwood from East Nusantara, Timor, Flores. That's the first island, I think, the Portuguese look for sandalwood because there's abundance of sandalwood trees over there. And then Java, of course, because this is the most fertile island of all. A lot of volcanoes, and that makes the soils very fertile. And also because of the fertility of its soils, it produces a lot of foods. And also, as elsewhere in the world, you have food, and then you have a big populations. Yeah, that's in Java. So that is because all of this kingdom based on manpower. So that's not based on territory. As also elsewhere in the world, the traditional kingdom is based on people, how many people that can work for you, not based on the territory. So because of this vast populations, a lot of big kingdoms coming out from Java. First is Demak as the first Islamic state, and then it moved inward to Mataram, right now Solo and Jogja, and you have the Mataram Islam. That's a scatter of a lot of small kingdoms everywhere based on commodities and based on people. More commodities you have, more people you have, the more commodities you have, so the stronger your kingdom. Otherwise, you become the vassal of the bigger kingdoms. Yeah, that's very, very normal at the time before the Portuguese came in. But the Portuguese, I think, they came for a short period of time. Also, the Spanish came for a short period of time until the Dutch really settled and monopolized trade in these archipelagos.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add Mada's excellent point by just giving a more general perspective of this vast archipelago. Mada has mentioned that this archipelago is located in between two imperial power, which is China and India. But this does not mean that the archipelago was a subject of a domination of these two, because this vast archipelago is also basically, it is located in the most active and one of the oldest trading route on earth, right? That connect China and India. So it's very open, it's very fluid, dynamic, rich, and already has a very complex system of credits, of a long distance exchange and political economy of extractions, right? So just to set that on the table. And second, the trade networks is very dense. You see urban centers and commercial cultures, in this vast archipelago. In terms of the polities, there are three overlapping polities. One is the maritime trading states. Mada has mentioned Sriwijaya is one of them, and also Malacca. So Malacca is actually a hub of this network, one of the hubs but one of the major hubs of this network. There's also agrarian court kingdoms like Majapahit and Demak. These are all, usually they are located in the interior of the islands like Java. And they usually consist of, rice cultivators. And then there are also, after especially 1200s, Islamic sultanates, where they actually they're not taking over existing kingship, but they input political and Islamic law into what's already existing. But what is also important to know, to remember, is that Mada has mentioned also the other kingdoms. In this vast archipelago, there are also smaller states. There were lordships, especially in the coastal area, And all of this is to say that their relationship with each other is not territorial, as Mada has highlighted, but rather relational. The more you have connection and protection from the bigger one, or the closer you are. So it's always through negotiation, and the negotiation is plural. It's not always static. So in terms of politics and rulers, how they gain power or lose power is usually by attracting merchants, by guaranteeing safety, regulate exchange, commanding loyalty. So it's not about monopolizing territory. So it's very important to remember that this period is often called what Tony Reid calls an age of commerce. So this is a commercial trading route that is vast, plural, dense, and dynamic.
The Portuguese, again, they seized Malacca in 1511. That's the year after they conquered Goa on the Indian coast, and it was, in a sense, the dawn of European colonialism. But the Portuguese at the time, they were far from any sort of overwhelmingly dominant or hegemonic regional power. Even after conquering such a great trading city like Malacca, they were just one regional power among many. What form of colonialism were the Portuguese practicing in the 16th and 17th centuries? Why did they deem it necessary to secure trade goods through naval warfare rather than just showing up in the area with goods to trade? And what impact did it have when they put an end to Malacca as the center, or a important center, of this regional trading system? How did Malacca's demise disorganize the larger Asian trade system and the regional balance of political, economic, and military power?
So for much of the years up until the late 1400s, right, 1490s, the Americas and the other side of the pond, which is Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, they didn't have that much contact with each other. And then the Europeans, started their expedition, especially to find the so-called the Spice Islands, right? So Arab traders have been, they brought spices, this especially rare and very expensive spices like nutmeg, cloves, and mace to Europe. And so they were very curious, and they started their expedition. So Columbus took the wrong turn, and we all know where he ended. But Portuguese, they went on the expedition successfully, ended up in the Indian Ocean world, and found this vast, dynamic, already, rich, complex system of trading in the Indian Ocean world, right? And they ended up in Goa, and nobody bet an eye on them, right? So they went back and brought their naval ships, and then finally conquered Goa and built fortress. So what is Portuguese colonialism? What is their form? The form is it's a fortress based. It's maritime based, and it's coercive. It's parasitical. It's not territorial. Their aim is not to create settler colonialism, but rather the goal at the time is to insert themselves into the existing Asian trade network and impose their terms. And this is why they conquered Goa, right? And then after that, they brought more naval ships and then conquered Malacca. 1511. And so when they conquered Malacca, what they did was, Malacca was actually a hub because it regulated circulation of trades, right? And what the Portuguese did was to actually impose rents and toll, something along that line, and then imposing the trade system into their own terms that is beneficial for them. So if we ask ourselves, why did they use naval warfare? I think that, Dan, you mentioned that, right? Why are they not just involved in the trade? Because they could not compete in the trade. These people have already built a very highly developed, commercially sophisticated system. They knew each other. They have better local knowledge. They have trust network. Their generation, they have built commerce relationships through trust, through networks for generations, and they have already established credit system. And the Portuguese could not compete.
And they don't have good stuff.
They don't have good stuff either to sell.
Like people don't want anything that the Portuguese are offering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Malacca was a hub in the trade networks. And when or after Portuguese took it over, it destabilized the region. What happened? Because people did not want to pay just to pass through Malacca. So what happened then, these merchants went to the neighboring ports. They went to Johor, they went to Aceh, they went to Banten, they went to Makassar. And because of this, they started to have competition between the smaller states. And then there were competitions and some fightings, and then hence it brought what used to be a dynamic and balanced trading system into a chaos.
Made.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. This has become what Portuguese did was very, very different from the trading system that was already existed in that region for a long, long time. For example, the Chinese will come to what is known as the Nusantara or the archipelago with silk, with ceramics, with China, that's what they call it right now in the West, with so many goods that they don't produce in the regions. That we call it trade. So that's an exchange for gold, for example, in West Kalimantan. They produce a gold and also spices and also a lot of, in some part also lodge. Also sandalwoods and everything like that. Trading from India, especially well known for perfume, also for certain spices that's not available in the archipelago. That's common. It's very common at that time. So it's real trade. People exchange goods. And then, of course, there's a party. Of course, there's what you call it, Chabandar, that the people who administer the ports at that time. This is usually the ambassador for the from foreign nations in one small kingdom, either it is in Sumatra, in Java, Borneo, or Sulawesi, or Maluku, something like that. And then the Portuguese came. They don't have anything to trade because they're coming from far away. Yeah, they come with people. They come with the military, with soldiers, and they come with technology. I think what they learned from the Chinese, the cannon, the galleon with the cannon. That's what they have. So they establish a fortress, and then they tax people who doing trade, who doing commerce among the for various people from all over the regions. So that's what I agree with Anna that what they did, they tax people, they put levies on goods, and then of course the people then find the alternatives. So that's why you have I think at that time when Malacca being conquered, Demak is rise as the first Islamic state in Java, rise as the maritime power, as on the competition with Malacca. And that forced the Portuguese going to the west. But because they have money, and then they have more people coming from the Europe, and they afford to build their fortress until Maluku, which is still exists right now in Ambon, in city of Ambon.
The Dutch arrived in the last decade of the 16th century in the form of these competing private outfits that were undertaking what were called wild voyages, these separate kind of operations, each on their own, out there competing to secure the region's spices. But in 1602, the Dutch Estates General forced these competing companies into the United East India Company, or VOC, one giant state-chartered company that was given basically state-like powers to sign treaties, wage war, build fortresses. Alongside the British East India Company, these were the first joint stock companies in the world, a really important moment in the history of capitalism and colonialism alike, which tells us all something about the fundamental interrelationship about the history of capitalism and colonialism, all in pursuit of East Indian riches. And so it was 1619 that the VOC established the first permanent European presence on Java, establishing Batavia, which centuries later becomes Jakarta. In 1641, they seized Malacca from the Portuguese, who were overwhelmed by the VOC's superior ships and armaments. And this is after they had seized Ambon and the Spice Islands of Malacca in 1605. At the same time, the Spanish were establishing themselves in what would become the Philippines and also intervening in Maluku, set the stage for the 17th century Dutch arrival. How did the VOC's approach to colonialism differ from the Portuguese, and why did they prove so much more powerful? And then what did the VOC want, and how did their project fit into the larger project of Dutch colonialism at this critical moment at the dawn of European colonial capitalist modernity?
So the Portuguese colonialism was improvised. I like to call it experimental. They didn't know what they're doing. It's thinly resourced. They report to the king. VOC, Verenigde Oost-India Company, founded 1602, the United East India Company, was a whole different world at that time, right? Because they were corporate, they were monopolistic, they were also state-backed by the colonial state and colonial capitalism. And so remember also, it's very important to remember that this is also the beginning of, if not the midst of, the Dutch Golden Age. It means that the Netherlands at the time they already had advanced credit markets, insurance, accounting, advanced financial system. So when the VOC set the sail to the Dutch East Indies, they left not to insert themselves to the trade system, but rather to monopolize. They wanted monopoly. For what? The spices. There was a very good book by Amitav Ghosh, The Nutmeg Curse, which actually gave a very good picture in the first few chapters about how it started, the monopoly started. And that actually was then replicated later, not just in the Dutch East Indies, even until today. Let me tell you what's the story. Jan Pieterszoon Koen led these naval ships to the Banda Islands. So Portuguese never actually ended in the islands of cloves, that produce cloves and nutmeg and maize, right? Especially nutmeg and maize, right? So Portuguese never ended there. They ended in Maluku, but never in the Banda Island. But Jan Pieterszoon Koen ended there. And they told the people there that you guys should sell your nutmeg only to me. We want to control all of your nutmeg trade. Of course, the people already had connections and merchant, trading network with China and India. They couldn't do that. They didn't want to do that. When they said they didn't want to do that, you know what the Dutch did? They killed the whole population, and the leftover population had to flee to neighboring islands, took over the island, and then brought slaves to cultivate nutmeg. So genocide, it has been a technique of Western colonialism along with the use of military power.
This is 1621.
Yeah,
exactly. 1621. Yeah, very, very early in the Dutch of expedition. And remember also, yes, we talk about how 1609 they started in Batavia, but it took 9 months, right, for these naval ships to go from the Netherlands to the archipelago. So actually 1621 is still very early in their voyage. But going back to the power of VOC, VOC was again corporate company, corporate colonial company, which means that they have the power to wage war. They could sign treaties. They can mint money. They can build fortresses. They can administer territory and govern population. It is like a floating state. That's the kind of power that they have, and they're financed by joint stock capital that is embedded within the Dutch project of global commercial expansion.
And also, one important thing besides genocides, they install their own local rulers. So if you are not in line with the the VOC will kick you out and put another ruler with what's in line with their policies. They did it everywhere, in all over the archipelago. So it's a very different game. I think the remnants of that we can see it right now with the American powers, something like that. So there's a parallel in that it started. I think all of the great powers in the West, I think, learns a lot from what the VOC did in the 17th century.
Yeah, let's get a little more into the 17th and 18th century. In Java, the VOC increasingly interjected itself into civil conflict and court rivalries, which led to these multiple wars of succession, leading to a huge civil war in the mid-18th century that was ended with the Dutch partitioning the Javanese kingdom into two kingdoms with seats in the cities of Yogyakarta and Surakarta. And then, meanwhile, they were attempting to impose their monopoly, often quite brutally, as you mentioned, and in the case of the genocide in Banda, impose their trade monopoly on the Straits of Malacca, but they couldn't fully control it. There were regional contests and conflicts that drew in the Bugis, the Makasaris, the Minangkabau, Ilanun raiders from the Philippines, and more. They acquired the Maluku island of Run from the British alongside Suriname in exchange for handing over New Amsterdam, later, of course, New York City. There was pepper, textiles, coffee, all in circulation along, again, as has been mentioned, a massive slave trade. So set the scene here. While the Dutch would in the 19th century extend a more formal, direct colonial power deep into the heart of Java and then across the archipelago, throughout the 17th and 18th century, they're still attempting to dominate trade more than territory, attempting to exercise control, as you just mentioned, Made, exercise control over the region through proxy rulers rather than direct governance. So how in these long centuries before the Dutch established Indonesia as a unified colonial possession, how did Dutch imperial power operate amid this scramble for wealth and power that involved so many different local, regional, and global powers? How can we characterize the quality and limits of Dutch colonial sovereignty during that period?
Yeah, I think the Dutch tried to not to conquer actually. So because they are such a small countries with limited manpower, with the limited military, and they know their capacity. So what they did is that they went from kingdom to kingdom, forced them to sign a contract. And then by that contract, they secure the trade, they secure the commodity. That's only the trade, but also the commodity. They try to establish the monopoly of commodities, which is a lot of varieties in the archipelagos. So starting from that, and then they establish usually they establish an office in there, and also collected taxes from the local rulers, because they studied the system before. Because if you're a smaller kingdom, you have to pay tribute to a bigger kingdom. That was the rule in the archipelago. So it's a kind of form of taxes. You pay some money to the bigger kingdom for the protection. That's what they offer to this smaller kingdom. So there's a short contract, there's a long-term contracts, and then slowly they put their power inside the court. It's every kingdom. So they pick who will be the king, and then kick out all of the force that might oppose their power. So that's what they did in Java, in Sumatra, for example, but mostly in Java, because Java at that time already become the center of these archipelagos. Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that this is still very early in the Dutch colonial expansion and settlement in Indonesia. So what's really important that at this a very early stage, like Made said, they didn't really have a plan to settle there, to have a territorial settlement there, but they want monopoly. So their approach is very much strategic, and also then because of that, obviously opportunistic, right? So they occupy ports, because they knew that that was profitable and that was a center of trade. They also occupied or control sea lanes and also production zones. That's why they make sure that they were, in Batavia, so that they're close to the hinterland of Java. And to build political alliances, including by interfering in the, secession disputes, right? And so also very important, very early at this time, is that they hired, for lack of a better word, they put the Chinese communities in a role of as a middleman and commercial intermediaries. Why? Because the Dutch, they didn't have the local knowledge, they don't have the language, yet they need to have some kind of rule. They didn't want to directly rule the natives, so they did indirect rule by hiring these Chinese communities that has actually been there for a long time, even before colonialism, right, through migration and all that. But the Chinese role in the society started to change because of the Dutch colonialism, which later we will see through the application of legal law and all that, where they are placed in the hierarchy.
And that'll be consequential through the present. We'll return to this throughout the series.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, 100%. So what was the effect in this early colonial period of the Dutch? One is that they normalized violence in terms of genocide and also continuous coercion. And then also narrowing down economic options for the natives, right? Because now they had to, pay some tax, or they had to cultivate cash crops, etc., etc., and also reshaping political authority, such as in the case of what Made has explained before in terms of the court politics, internal politics.
It's not only the Chinese that acts as a middleman, but also the Arabs and the Indians, especially the Arabs. They are also put in a community to control the port, because there's quite a big Arab communities in several regions in the archipelago. So they used these Arab communities as the intermediaries in order to control the local populations.
Yeah, Blimade, you actually reminded me also that it is also important to mention that a lot of people from the eastern Indonesia were transported to Java to be slaves.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, especially if you look at the what is that, in the Batavia in the 17th and 18th centuries, and a lot of slaves coming from Bali, actually, from my regions, because it's a huge commodities from Bali's out to the other region is slaves, because it's a very small island, not so many fertile island, but a lot of population, so they trade slaves. So that's why the Betawi language has a lot of Balinese words in there, because of sizable Balinese were being transported as slaves to Batavia at that time.
And we before we move on, we just mentioned that this intermediary place that Dutch colonialism creates for Chinese people, that throughout the rest of Indonesian history, it becomes incredibly complicated and controversial. Already in 1740, the Dutch colonial authorities sponsored a massacre of 10,000 Chinese in Java, in and around Batavia. And it's an atrocity that then leads to another round of civil wars on Java.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. I think at that time they think that the Chinese, the number of the Chinese is too big, so that kind of atrocities happen because they want to control the Chinese too.
Yeah, I think it's hard to not make a parallel to current empires, in terms of the use of preemptive strategy when it comes to possible threats. Because what happened with the Chinese massacre in 1740, it was because there was this economic decline in the sugar industry, right? Because of overproduction, and Marx actually explained this. Overproduction eventually created the falling of price. So it then was responded by Chinese sugar workers with just a little bit of riot, right? But then the company, the VOC, used this preemptive strategy by raiding houses and actually killing children, women, workers, all the way up until about 10,000 Chinese died, actually. And also creating rumors that, about the Chinese, that actually fueled already the flame that already existed also among the natives, because for the natives too, the Chinese intermediaries were visible agents of extraction, right? They were the representative of the Dutch, essentially. So that led to, the first Chinese massacre in the region.
I think it is after the massacres, the Dutch then think about applying the ghettos in their territories, especially in Java. So they put the Chinese in one compound, not to call it ghettos, but in one compound. They cannot go out during the night. And there's one captain becomes the leader of these Chinese. And
Kapitan China.
The Kapitan China. Their main task was that this captain is collecting tolls. So collecting taxes, the toll road, especially in Java, when the Japanese farmers want to go to the market, they have to pass by the road controlled by the Chinese. They have to pay for that. So this creates a resentment against the Chinese since even the 18th century already. There's a lot of resentment against what's called a toll road tax, yeah. And also the Chinese are collecting the tax for salt that were traded in one territory, for example. So, yeah, the Dutch used them effectively. And also they also control the Chinese because they cannot go out during the night because most of the Chinese are traders. So they trade during the day and then they monopolize certain commodities like salt. So salt sold by the Chinese merchants, and then the Chinese captain take tax out of that, increase the price a little bit. Yeah, this create resentment even until now toward the Chinese, especially by the Japanese. Yeah.
At the close of the 18th century, the VOC was not in great economic shape, and they were obviously pillaging a lot of resources from the archipelago, but it was also an extraordinarily expensive operation. And it was right around that moment that the Netherlands was invaded and taken over by Napoleonic France. This period is really important because it transforms colonial governance in the East Indies. Napoleon's general, Herman Willem Daendels, he takes charge as governor general, dissolves the VOC, and places its properties under direct government ownership. And begins to move administratively towards a more direct form of colonial governance, building the building blocks of a modern state. In 1811, though, the British East India Company conquered Java from the French, and they were in power until 1815, when the Dutch retook control in the wake of Napoleon's defeat in Europe. But the British East India Company, under Thomas Stamford Raffles, they continued the French program to centralize government authority and modernize administration. What was the impact of the French and British in terms of laying the groundwork for more direct European sovereignty over Java and then the rest of the archipelago, and also laying the groundwork structurally for this colonial state that was becoming formally the Dutch East Indies? And then lastly, how did that intensification of colonial control ultimately spark this very decisive Java War against the Dutch, which went from 1825 to 1830? It was a war that marked an extremely bloody loss, the end of any sort of independent power for the royal courts of central Java and the Javanese aristocracy.
So Dan, you're right that the end of VOC was because it was becoming very expensive. But really what sealed the decision of the Dutch government in the metropole was because VOC, the company, was also very corrupt. So they sent people to investigate and did analysis, and apparently there was a lot of corruption going on, that they decided that VOC was no longer profitable for the metropole. And at the same time, the Napoleonic Wars was going on. And so Daendels was sent as a governor general during this so-called interregnum era, right? So there is the French interregnum, which is Daendels, and with Raffles is called the British interregnum. These two leaders, or the two the governor general, were very much inspired by the Enlightenment. And what it means is that, and there are different strands of the Enlightenments, but this is the kind of Enlightenment that was used to back up colonialism, to make it even better and even more, to justify colonialism, right? So what Daendels did with his idea of Enlightenment-inspired ideas is to bring modernization into the now Dutch East Indies. First, I'm gonna hold that over there first, and then to say that this is also the beginning of the shift. We were talking about the early period of the Dutch colonialism, which was indirect and fragmented and was characterized by corporate extraction. Now we are shifting to the beginning of a more centralized colonial state, a more state-organized form of exploitation. So Daendels, he wanted to modernize. The idea of Enlightenment is this, that these lazy and backward Javanese, needs to be enlightened through modern infrastructure and modern bureaucracy. So he created he introduced new institutions, a more bureaucratized hierarchy of organization that now appear in the local level in terms of like village heads and bupati regions, etc. But also he built the so-called Grote Postweg, which is the Great Postal Way, which connect actually Java from the west all the way, from Banten all the way to the eastern part. And this is so consequential because then it helped ease governing the whole Java, with postal and reporting. It's much easier to be sent to the center later on is now no longer in Batavia, but rather in Buitenzorg, which is now Bogor, right? So that's under him. And then that was only 5 years, actually, Daendels was ruling it. Then there is Thomas Stamford Raffles, which is, and then he ruled under the British interregnum, also Enlightenment inflected. and he want to introduce rational and more systematic bureaucracy. And what he did was then to really diminish the power of the Javanese court, which already was diminishing, right? But we talk about it, by the 1700s, because of War of Secession, and when these kingdoms were, especially in Central Java, were divided into four principalities. Then they basically became a servant of the Dutch colonial government. So they turned the power of the court, the court and the royal court into a servant of Dutch bureaucracy to then help rule the people directly. So essentially, the political autonomy of Javanese court was weakened at this time. Now, you also talk about the war. So what happened during this time also was there was a lot of exploitation of the people directly by the Dutch as they were trying to govern the area. And so there was a lot of poverty and famine. Because now people, what used to be they cultivate for subsistence, they also now have to pay some of those crops for tax, right? And because of that, then also it led to this poverty. And so Diponegoro, who is a prince, he is a prince, and he led this war against colonialism, which lasted for 5 years. But that was a very brutal. Kiai Mojo, his religious teacher, helped lead the war. It was a guerrilla war. Imagine like Indonesian, prince with the Indonesian natives with their very simple weapons trying to fight colonial, Dutch colonial power with their very advanced artillery, right? But yet there were 200,000 Javanese who died, and also some thousand European who died. And because of that, the Dutch government almost went bankrupt. That's the reason why after this Java war that ended in 1830, we then entered the so-called the cultuurstelsel system or the cultivation system.
What's going on at the time was that it started from the competition for power in court of Yogyakarta. Then it led, once prince become estranged from the palace and start a rebellion. I think what the Diponegoro wants in my thinking at the time was that because the only powerful actors in the court was the Dutch, so everybody has to get the blessings of the Dutch. So it's impossible if you don't show your power, and then the Dutch will pick anybody who I think that they can control. So the Diponegoro start this movement, I think outside the Yogyakarta, and then it's because of there's a lot of movement like that before by other prince, but why Diponegoro movement becomes so big was because of the conditions that Anne has already mentioned before. There's a famine, the climate is not suitable for crops, so the failure of the crops, I think the failure in agriculture at that time is so massive. So that's why it creates a fertile ground for rebellion. And I think the Dutch at that time just came back to their previous power. I think want to eliminate this movement as soon as possible. I think instead of stopping the movement, it makes it bigger because it use coercion more, use military power more. So I think it becomes so big. It drained resources both in the Dutch side, also in the Javanese people side, and also the court side.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com. and by Comrades.education and Decolonize Sudan, two educational projects that have joined forces to launch an online political education series situating the genocide in Sudan within the broader global system of imperialism and racial capitalism. Across 6 sessions, organizers, scholars, artists, and legal advocates will explore the political economy of genocide, the Sudanese revolutionary legacy, women's resistance, borders as tools of empire, diaspora responsibility, and the power of transnational solidarity. The incredible lineup of voices includes Noura Erakat, Ala Saleh, Mutasim Ali, Ahmed Caballo, Mastoria Bakit, Sarah Louise Ayo, Aaron Mate, and more. All our struggles are connected. Survival depends on solidarity. Build your capacity for solidarity and resistance with us. Sudan, Confront Empire Together, begins April 5th and is co-sponsored by Adala Justice Project, MSA National, Rise Up for Sudan, and the International Human Rights Law Institute. Visit comrades.education to sign up today. When the Dutch won the Java War in 1830, this, after 200 plus years on Java, including 150 years deeply involved in the interior, at this point, they imposed full colonial control on the island and began to do the same across the entire archipelago. And we'll get into that military commercial expansion in a moment. But it was at this moment of formal colonial rule when they implemented the cultuurstelsel system, or cultivation system, which required at the village level set quantities of agricultural products, export agricultural products, to be sold to the colonial government. It was a really punishing system of resource plunder on top of a punishing system of taxation that led to famine as village land was shifted from subsistence cultivation of rice to export crops. Meanwhile, Javanese aristocrats no longer ruled, but they did secure hereditary right to official posts and became administrators of Dutch colonial rule, so-called priai. What was the significance of this shift from the prior century's mercantile empire that was intent on controlling trade to this more modern empire that was about controlling territory? And then how did the cultivation system and the full imposition of Dutch colonial rule change everyday life, society, economies, governance on Java and elsewhere across the archipelago? What commodities became central to the economy in various parts of the colony, and how did that all fit into the larger world capitalist system of the 19th century?
So after the two interregnum eras, the Dutch East Indies was transferred to the Netherlands, right? And then the Governor General, the Dutch Governor General that then led it was, his name is Van den Bosch. So when Van den Bosch arrived in the Dutch East Indies in 1830, he inherited from Raffles and the two interregnum leaders a region that was already centralized, has been in the process of modernizing in the form of modern bureaucratic and centralized, and also expanding toward the so-called the outer island. And when we talk about the outer island, it's any other islands outside of Java, including Sumatra. So a more modern institutions. But also because of the Java War, he also inherited lots of debt. The Dutch government almost went bankrupt, right? Like I mentioned before. So then what he did was he installed the so-called cultuurstelsel, which is the cultivation system. It's a mandatory unpaid labor in which the people, like you mentioned then, the native were taxed by having to cultivate usually a fifth of their land to cultivate a cash crop for export. And then rather than, and then so the villages have to grow this cash crop for rather than rice. And also, again, inherited from the two in the interregnum era, there is already started the so-called the direct rule, right, in which through the help of the royal people, which you mentioned the name, it's usually called the priai. And priai means people who were descended through royal lineage, basically, at the time, so royal family. And so these people were used to help to enforce the kulturstelsel system by forcing labor and to do the direct rule. So most of you as the commodity, most of the commodity, that mainly it revolved around sugar and coffee. So in fact, actually, at one point, many of these people before the kulturstelsel system, they already was asked to rotate, between the cultivation and rice and the cultivation of sugar. And so, it actually diminished the quality of the soil. But anyway, so sugar and coffee were still central alongside indigo, but then later also tea and tobacco. And then they also expanding it in the outer islands with Sumatra producing tobacco, also oil, right? And then rubber, right? Rubber trees. There is forest products and plantation agriculture, and also mining. So everywhere that the Dutch went, everywhere they went, they claimed the right to rule the land, to rule the people, and to rule the resources directly. And they also impose, remember, modernizing. So they impose regular supply and also predictable output. They impose that, they require that, and they also discipline the population. But this idea of modernization continued throughout the 1800s, which later on we see the creation of modern shipping line as we talk about the next period, which is the liberal period.
Yeah, I think something is going on after the cultivation shifting or kulturstelsels. I think the Dutch imitate what's already becomes a traditions in so many courts in this region, especially in Java, that people have to spend some time as a forced labor to the kingdom, to the king. Indonesia has a word for this, kerja rodi, which is a forced labor, probably 30 days in a year. You have to work on a sultan's rice field or something like that. So you have to work as a forced labor to maintain the road, for example, and then right now the Dutch transferred the system into the forced labor to cultivate certain cash crops or certain commodities for the state. So commodities that valuable in international markets. But also we have to remember during this time, also because the Dutch knows that this will create a huge consequences for the subsistence economic in Java or in other islands, especially in Java. So they also find an alternatives, I think, alternative food for the indigenous people. So the introduction of cassava, for example, the introduction of maize, for example, it happened around these times. So they try to, in some area, it's become the staple for the indigenous populations. So as a substitute to rice. Also at that time, it's become a humiliation. You humiliate because you don't eat rice. You have to eat cassava, for example. You have to eat corn, for example. That's even until now. I think that's the perception that you are not rich enough. You are poor people in the society. That's in the culture. So. But yes, I think the commodities at that time, sugar, especially sugar in Java, because that's the beginning of the revolution of the sweet in the world. So people are starting to commodify the sweets that was unknown before. So from sugarcane, so a lot of land was converted. The fertile land is converted into sugarcane plantations and also indigo and everything.
So during this time, also, there was a very famous literature that we need to mention when we talk about Kulturstelsel, a novel called Max Havelaar, which was written by Multatuli. It's a pen name of Douwes Dekker. And he was a Dutch official who was sent to Banten in Java, and he saw this culture system and how it was very exploitative, and it creates so much suffering on the native people that he wrote about it in the novel, and that it got to be known by people in Europe.
And we should emphasize that suffering under the cultivation system was creating extraordinary wealth that built the modern Netherlands, and it was so much wealth that it was even wealth that the Dutch colonial government used to compensate slave owners for the emancipation of their slaves in Suriname across the world.
Exactly, yes.
Throughout the 19th and first years of the 20th century, the Dutch, with a new colonial army, brutally consolidated their control beyond Java across the archipelago's multitudinous outlying islands in this global context of the new imperialism, this European scramble to lock down every inch of territory on Earth. And by this point, the European military advantage over various Indonesian polities had become just overwhelming, allowing the Dutch to violently put down rebellions from the Bugis and Makassarese states in South Sulawesi, in the highlands of Toraja, and in Bali. And there's so many horrific scenes from this period, but one to point out here is the Dutch massacres and mass suicides of the Balinese aristocracy and royalty. The Pupatans were particularly brutal and gory. On Borneo or Kalimantan, the Dutch competed with the British, who were establishing outposts at Penang and Singapore. Throughout the 19th century, the Dutch and British, they were signing treaties that exchanged territories with one another, giving them British Malacca and Dutch India and the Gold Coast, while the Dutch got full control over Sumatra. The British also provided Indian contract laborers for Suriname. On Sumatra, the Dutch had to overcome an Islamic revivalist resistance from a group called the Padris that was in the process of overthrowing the Minangkabau royal family, a royal family that turned to the Dutch for support. On Sumatra, they also engaged in a long series of violent wars of conquest against the Batak, and also, quite importantly, against the Sultan of Aceh, who controlled a very wealthy, powerful state at the northern tip of Sumatra. And this was a conflict that burned for decades as a fierce guerrilla struggle, a struggle that arguably never quite ended, if I understand correctly, throughout the remainder of the Dutch colonial era. Lay out this history. How did the Dutch, with their new colonial army, expand from Java to establish firm colonial control across this entire archipelago in this broader global colonial context of the scramble for territory, resources, labor, military power? And how did this result in both new forms of rule and new forms of intensified capitalist accumulation that emerged alongside something that was really coterminous with this expansion of political and military power across the region?
Yeah, I think it started from 1830s. Just a couple of years after the Javanese War, it started. There's a rebellion in Minangkabau, in West Sumatra. It's a very famous war, but started from the revolution by the Islamists. What do you call it right now? The Islamists, but Imam Bonjol was a student of ulama in Mecca, and then want to impose a strict Islamic law in the region. and then has to face the local aristocracy, which then asked the Dutch for the backup. Then there's a huge war, including a war from Minangkabau to the southern part of the Sumatra, like Sibolga and surrounding areas. And then after that, in 1850s, there's a Banjar War, the Banjarmasin, where the Dutch tried to subjugate the Banjar kingdom. And they succeeded at that time. And then they monopolized the pepper trading because of Banjar at that time was the one very famous with pepper. After that war, I think the war simultaneously in the first half of 1800 that really drained the coffers of the kingdom. So then they have to come up with something different. So they come up with in 1873 they come up with the agrarian law, which I think it has an important point for foreign investment. So this is not the state, the Netherlands state anymore, but also the foreign direct investment, that the foreign company can rent land for 75 years. And it started from in Java, especially for the sugarcane plantation before, but I think the most significant development was in East Sumatra, where there's a capitalist plantation belt with various communities over there, rubbers, tobacco, and so they imported coolies or contract laborers, indentured labor from Java. So the effect we can see until now in North Sumatra, the Javanese become the biggest population over there. I think 45% of the population of North Sumatra are Javanese as the result of this indentured labor, and also the perennial conflict, agrarian conflict between the labor and the plantation. It used to be the foreign companies. So Goodyear has a plantation over there, and also the tea plantations, and also I think the beginning of the palm oil plantation also started in East Sumatra. But until now, this is a very, very significant development, liberal period, which has I think a greater consequences compared to the culture cells because of it developed the entire archipelago. And then after that, the Dutch, after seeing that this brings a lot of money, starting to modernizing the archipelago by, I think, Indonesia, what we call right now Indonesia, become the first island to have a train. Also in Sumatra, in Medan area, I think that's the first train outside the Europe, because that's how developed the region at the time was. And then of course they need to expansions to the north in East Sumatra, so they try to conquer Aceh in 1920s. And my little island, Bali, was among the last actually to join the Netherlands East Indies in 1921. So yeah, by that Puputan and something, but not because of the reasons of direct investment, but for the reason of they want to create Bali as a tourist island already at that time. So the what is that, the Muscat, the ship company.
Maskapai,
Already.
KPM.
Yeah, KPM. Yeah, it's already sailing to Bali with a lot of tourists from the United States, from Europe. You see, after they conquered Bali, there's a lot of very famous people over there. It's like, who's that? movie star. Who's that?
Charlie Chaplin?
Charlie Chaplin was in Bali around that time. Yeah, around that time. Yeah, that's just because, it's already, they're already thinking about the Bali as the touristic island. And that is, that idea was then continued by another colonial government, which is Indonesia. Yeah. Yeah.
Anne.
I'm just going to add to what Mada has explained. In terms of the military might, the conquest is slow, right? Meaning that it was slowly done. It was slowly done, but it's usually as a response to rebellions that's occurring in the different islands. And again, this is still very early. There is not really an imagination of a united Indonesia in the imagination of the natives, nor for the Dutch. They wanted territory. They wanted to have a direct rule, but they were not actually thinking about the creation of the Indonesia as it is today. And really, that expansion occurred because of their effort to topple or to stop rebellion in the different areas. And so once this rebellion, this wars, Padri, in Halmahera, and many other places that Mada has mentioned, once that's done, then what they did was, because of remember the modern bureaucratization process of administration, the Dutch started to put their government official in the different regions. And so they call them, these are the regions, they put it in these different places. This is when we started to have a more systematic bureaucracy outside of Java. So as you see, the development is uneven. Java was already, cultivated more evenly, but then slowly Sumatra was incorporated, especially along the Sumatra belt. And then later in the Eastern Island, slowly that happened. And so that set a very good stage for the liberal period.
Yeah. They have been using the indigenous people for their army to conquer one kingdom. But it's become more bureaucratized after the Aceh War, what they call it, the military expedition. So they recruit people from the minorities areas, from the Minahasa Christian, Ambonese Christians to become the soldiers, and also some Javanese, which is not really devout Muslim, especially from Banyumas or the southern part of Java. That becomes soldiers going to the military expedition to Aceh, to Bali, and to other places. And I think when you saw the image of the Aceh War, for example, a lot of Acehnese were being killed by the military. Actually, it's killed by the native soldiers from that was recruited for that purpose. So that's because the modern army has become the modern bureaucracy, and also it's begun to the modern company. That's the most important part of the liberal era.
Briefly, we should note that at this point, the Portuguese remain in power in East Timor, the eastern side of the island of Timor, and on New Guinea, on the island of New Guinea, the Dutch control the western part, while the British and Germans split the eastern part. And it's important to mention this because the partition of both of these islands will be key to understanding later events.
Yeah, I think the Portuguese got the East Timor because they are not valuable. It's a very arid part of Timor. And there's not so much commodities over there. This is only as a token for the Portuguese that they are once mighty power in this archipelago. But for the western part of the Guinea, that's another different stories, because this coming from mutual understanding between the British and the German and the Dutch. And the Dutch, I think, didn't pay much attention to this western part of the Guinea island until after the Indonesian Revolution, where they have to think about, at that time, they think about what to do with a lot of mestizo, a lot of what we call it in Indonesia, Indo, the interracial mix with European, Caucasian, and Malay or Indonesian, which is quite sizable in number. So originally, the western part of the Junia will be the land for this mestizo, for this Indo to live and build their own republics. That's why it's become the Dutch think that the fate of this island, I think, couldn't be determined after the transfer of sovereignty from the Dutch to Indonesia in 1949 because of that reason.
As liberals gained more influence over Dutch colonial policy, they pushed for reforms that replaced the cultivation system with a new, more private sector centered plantation system. So instead of just raw state coercion, the full power of capitalist markets was deployed to mobilize and exploit cheap labor across the archipelago. How did this liberal period change the Indonesian economic system, and how did it change life for ordinary people, particularly for peasants who were becoming a new proletariat, increasingly migrating across the vast archipelago in search of work alongside, from outside the colony, coolie indentured laborers subjected to often just brutal treatment? How did the new system compare to the cultivation system, and how did it manage to just further intensify capitalist production with the extraction of all sorts of resources, new and old: sugar, tea, tobacco, pepper, tin, coffee, gutta percha, and then rubber and oil? That last one, oil, this critical, essential 20th century commodity that allowed for the creation of the corporation Royal Dutch Shell.
I mentioned Max Havelaar, right? That was an example of how there was mounting criticism among the liberals and the people in the Netherlands against this repression and suffering that existed under the cultivation system. So what then happened was toward the end of 1860s, 69, they replaced it with the so-called the liberal policy. So the colonial government, the way they administer their production changed from the state organized coercion to market-driven capitalist extraction. All right, so we're seeing how we change from colonial state capitalism to a more colonial corporate capitalism. So in essence, the liberal period, they modernized colonialism. They did not soften it, they just modernized it. How did they modernize it? By opening it up, opening the colony to private European capital. And the result was we're seeing an explosion of plantation and extractive capitalism across the archipelago. So then you mentioned, sugar and some of these other products, right? So on Java, sugar was still the main primary commodity. And in fact, around this time, sugar production in the Dutch East Indies was the largest in the world, only second after Cuba. And it's also really, so sugar has been produced in the Dutch East Indies since the 1800s. But what's really important to see here is that how the sugar production was produced no longer under a direct colonial rule, but now it uses the so-called cartel and syndicate system. There is a term called sugar syndicate if you read newspapers, right? So what could this cartel and syndicate do? They control the labor directly, they control the production, but they also are able to influence colonial policy. Ring a bell? I mean, today, right? The capitalists, I mean, if you see Elon Musk working with the government, again, it has precedent even in the colonial time where these enterprises they had influence. They are able to change colonial policy to support their interests. And then we're seeing also some in East Sumatra, we have tobacco plantation, and then pepper in parts of Sumatra and Kalimantan, tin mining in Bangka and Belitung. And then you mentioned gutta percha. Now, gutta percha is a different thing because it was not produced at first as a plantation. So while these other, in Java and Sumatra, we had plantation, the production of gutta percha that made possible telegraphy, which is the first global telecommunication in the world, right? It was made possible by gutta percha. They were extracted in the depth of Borneo rainforest. So they were extracted through the help of, extracting the labor of Dayak people in the so-called open access frontiers, essentially, right? So that's the story of gutta percha.
And gutta percha is like a plastic type material?
It's a sap. Gutta percha is a sap that is used to insulate the telegraphic wires to allow these wires to be put under the sea. This is the first time that we in humanity are able to create connected network across, beyond an island, right? Across continents. And that also how the internet infrastructure today are created after, right? Using the same kind of logic and infrastructure. You mentioned also rubber and oil. So rubber we talk about, but oil is so important because then oil, the first oil company that operated there was Royal Dutch Shell, which belonged to the British and the Dutch. And this actually tied to the production of oil, tied now the Dutch East Indies to the energy infrastructure of modern industrial capitalism and global geopolitics, right? Later, we will talk about in 1970s with the booming of oil in modern independent Indonesia. But yes, oil is very important. Now, in terms of the changes of the people, the ordinary Indonesian people, one, we're seeing the so-called proletarianization of peasantry. There has been since the cultivation system, the primitive accumulation, right, in which peasants were taken off of their land, so they became landless peasants. So then they became mobile, selling their labor, in order to subsist. So that's one, and then also we're creating the mobile proletariat. People started to move from Central Java, for example, to eastern part of Java, which is where the plantations were, sugar plantations, and also people moving from Java to Sumatra, right? And then there were also the rise of indentured coolie labor, and Radin Fernando discussed the rise of non-agricultural economic activities, peddlers, smugglers, transport workers, traders, right? Did I mention traders already? And so these were the rise of non-agricultural economic activities allow for also the emergence of wage labor, where people started to be paid with money. So the money as a part of the economic system. It is so important to mention also that during this time, remember, this is a modernization of the economic production. The Dutch East Indies started to install modern infrastructure. Most notably that we see is in terms of communication network. Made mentioned KPM, the Koninklijk Paketvaart Maatschappij. This is the Royal Packet Navigation Company, the colonial shipping system, basically, that connected the whole archipelago and the archipelago with Europe. Why was it important? It's important because it created regular time scheduling, predictable shipping scheduling around the archipelago and between the colony and the metropole, and hence allowing not only for the Dutch side, right, regular reporting. They're very obsessed. If you study Dutch history, the archives are actually pretty clearly organized. There is this like mail rapporten, which were reports from from the GG, the Governor General, to the Ministry of Colony, or Mar van Overhaaf, which is reports of the residents. Residents is like governors in each of the residences reporting to the, and this was allowed, right, because of this very connected system of communication. And then, of course, we have railways that connected the hinterland of Java with the ports. And so all of this modernization of the communication infrastructure allowed also changes, meaningful changes for the everyday experiences for ordinary Indonesians. How? Because now they could also get on the train, even though they have to sit in the third class, for example, but they're able to easily go. It used to be you have to go on foot. Now you could go and you can connect to other cities, and they could see people from other regions. This is also important for the sense of sharedness as being colonized, basically. So it created new connection and new mobility for the natives.
I think I just add in the process of the proletarization of the peasants and the monetization of the economy, the rise of coolie as an indentured labor to work in so many company, especially plantations, but also the economy is not run by the state anymore, but instead is run by companies, not only from the Netherlands, from all over the world. Goodyear opened plantations, rubber plantations in East Sumatra at that time. So tobacco plantation started at the commodity. People starting to value tobacco, enjoying cigars, something like that is coming from East Sumatra. But at the same time, also the coolie systems. If you have heard by a Dutch writer, Mary Lulofs, wrote a beautiful novels titled Coolies, which depicts the system, how the companies hire the coolies and then trap them over there in the plantation for life. By the cycle of gambling and entertainment. So coolie can spend all of their salaries on gambling and then get poor again, work a renewed contract and everything, something like that. But also at the same time, you see that because of the technology, the infrastructure, you see across the board, not only among the Europe, or the foreign Orientals, but also among the natives. As Anne told us before, people are easily traveling from one places to the other place, and then the birth. And that's very most important. I think more important than that, I think the rise of new consciousness, which Ben Anderson called it as the print capitalism. Also, probably later on, we will talk about the rise of educated class, the modern educated class among the natives, especially those who coming from the lower elites, something like that. And then they not only travel, but also study, they speak Dutch, and they, acquire some knowledge, and they see in the first hand how they are being treated by those who are in power, and they also see how people live, people of their cohort, the same colors as them, being the second class in the system, then they're being radicalized. But we talk about that later on.
Made, before we get to that, I think we should pause here to describe the racial order imposed upon the colonies' people. Listeners are, of course, familiar with apartheid South Africa. How did the Dutch order compare, and what sort of categories within the hierarchy were there? Because obviously there's a basic hierarchical divide between indigenous and European, but there are also mixed-raced Indo-Europeans, Chinese, Japanese, Arab.
They're a little bit different between the apartheid, because the apartheid is a more rigid, integrated in the system. So in the apartheid, the white and then the Afrikaners and the black was separated. They are not interact. But under the Dutch East India systems, I think it's a more flexible. There's a flexibility. Of course, the white is still, or the European is still the first class. They are subject to the colonial law, the penal code. And then after that, the foreign Orientals, as I mentioned before, they are put into sort of a ghetto, a compound. Until now, you can see the remnants of this in Jakarta, for example, in the Glodok areas. There's used to be the compound for the Chinese, and then in Semarang, in Central Java, the capital city of Central Java, you see all of the neighborhoods near the Kota Tua, the old city. That's all for the Chinese. So and also that for foreign Orientals is applied to the Chinese and the Arabs and some of the Indian. And then they organize their own society, these foreign Orientals, and they subject to their own law. And the third one is the natives, the pribubis, who were subject to adat law. And this becomes very interesting, especially if we look at this in the current times, because a lot of us right now in Indonesia talk about the customary law, customary rights, customary or masyarakat adat, customary the indigenous people, for example. Yeah, that's actually left the natives or the pribumi has their own laws, and they're governed by their own system. So they are not changing it much about for the native. So, but later on, the independent Indonesian acquired the penal codes, which is applied to the European, and then put it into the modern state after the Indonesian independence. Yeah, but that's a different story. But these three segment of the society, they are interacted with each other, but of course they, at the same time they also have some of them have the privilege. For example, the first class in the train, and has told us before, the first class is only for the European, and probably the second class for the foreign Orientals, and the third is for the natives, something like that. So, and also if you have a pool or school, for example, there's no native can be admitted in that kind of school, even though you are probably adopted by the European. Is still because of your skin colors, you're different, that kind of things. But it's not as rigid as in South Africa, apartheid in South Africa.
And what about Indo-Europeans, people of mixed descent?
That's the second thing. This is Dutch is a small countries, and then they because of the transportations, it takes time to get here. It's almost half of the world. They have to sail in half of the world, and they send so many young people. So then these young people then, what is that? Not married actually, but has a contract wife. They call nyai, which is Pramudia put it in his famous novel, The Earth of Mankind, Bumi Manusia. This nyai then have the intercourse between the cohabitation between the European and the natives, and produced another kind of social layer called Indo. That's Indo. Indo is basically has the status of a European, but they are not really European because they are half natives, and also I think most of them are eating rice instead of bread. That was a very famous things about this. This is the European who eat rice. But they're, after a while, they're quite sizable in number. So they actually have the privilege to enter the bureaucracy at the lower level. So, but they, as I think most of the time in class with the pribumi, especially the educated pribumi, the educated natives, who are also in the same position as them. This is kind of competitions, mutual hatred, I think also, except that after Indonesian independence, I think a lot of them then went to the entertainment business, become a movie stars, singers, something like that. So because they are good looking, actually, they are good looking. They are really they are Eurasians, yeah, so very good looking, and I think we also as a natives we really like them. Yeah.
I just want to expand on Mada's great points that if we want to talk, I think if we want to talk about race, we must talk about law, because race is not just, it's not just lived, but it's actually legally produced. So when Mada said that there are these three different distinctions, that's actually legally produced. So the Europeans, and then the Vreemde Oosterlingen, which is foreign Orientals, including Chinese, Arabs, Indians, and then there is Inlanders, which is the indigenous Indonesians. And then in terms of law itself, there are two kinds of law. So there is the criminal law, and then there is the civil law. For the criminal law, there are two kinds. One, criminal code for Europeans that was created in 1867, which is really directly copying what they have in the Netherlands. And then there is the criminal code for non-Europeans, right? Now, how about Chinese? You might want to ask, right? Where did the Chinese fall under? The Chinese fell under the non-Europeans, but they were usually heard in different courts, and they're also organized by the Kapitan China, the officers, the Chinese officers, right? So how about the Chinese elites though? Now we need to also talk about racism within each of these grouping, right? Because the Chinese themselves, based on their purity of being Chinese. So if you are married to a nyai or not cohabitated with a nyai, your child is no longer considered pure Chinese, right? So there are the Chinese elites. Now the Chinese elite could actually apply to have legal equalization with Europeans. When they achieve that, then they will be judged based on using the criminal code for Europeans. And all of these two criminal codes were unified actually sometimes in the 1918. But in practice, it's still very much racially segregated. Now, that's criminal law. That we have also the civil law. Civil law was explicitly segregated by race, and they regulated everyday reproduction. Social reproduction of capitalism, colonial capitalism, was actually produced by the civil law. They regulate property, marriage, divorce, family, inheritance, residence, business, right? And they were never unified. And they're actually organized within their the community. And so while the Europeans, if you look at the civil law, they were very much seen as free individuals. With the Chinese, they are judged based on this paternalistic, very community-based, very male-centered and lineage-based. It has to be very much Chinese. While the inlanders were adat-based, they're often communal and also lineage-oriented. And that did not change up until, the independence.
In 1901, the Dutch instituted a major new framework called the ethical policy. Why did, at this moment, Dutch public opinion and government swing towards supporting a more, at least on the surface, a more humanitarian, civilizing brand of colonialism? And since this was, after all, still colonialism, did that really matter? Or was it just a sort of performative paternalism to make the Dutch feel better about what was still a brutally exploitative, oppressive social order?
The ethical policy we should see it more as a crisis management, right? There are several factors that ended to that crisis management. One is moral and political pressure in the Netherlands. Again, reports of famine, poverty, abuses, they continue to flow to the Netherlands, where the rise of the liberals and Christian humanitarian started to express their concern, and they it's basically no longer possible to continue this exploitation and extraction. Second, also economic transformation, because economically with the private capital, it's no longer possible to produce the economy, the colonial economy, using repression. What's actually more needed is more educated and disciplined workforce, right? Because now it's all modernizing. And this is why, we, from even the 1870s onward, we started to have this modernization of the infrastructure. So the extreme extraction threatened productivity and order. And this is the last thing that's, I think, another last important point, which then will be sustained throughout, which is this idea of fear of unrest. It's they need order, political stability for this private colonialism, private money, private-based colonialism to continue to exist. So then with the ethical policy, they started to think about the welfare of the natives. They focus on irrigation. They want to improve irrigation, education, public health. And then, so what happened for the ordinary Indonesians is then they started to have some changes in terms of agricultural output, due to the irrigation. There were some schools that's created, those small, significantly it's just for indigenous elites, but slowly they created schools in villages for native people. And then there were also roads, railways, and communication infrastructure that improve mobility. And so some native actually did live a healthier life, a much better life, and usually these are a more priai class. So to respond to what you say about performative paternalism, I don't think that's the case. I think it is paternalism, but in a more structured way. It's a structural paternalism in a way that the conditions were improved, but it was not designed for an improvement for everybody. It was a limited improvement to make colonialism more sustainable and palatable, not to create justice, not to create democracy. It is there to manage exploitation and not to end it. But what is really important to see from the ethical policy, because this is a period, a momentous period, in my view, for the history of Indonesia, is that all of this expansion of education, mobility, communication, and limited welfare among the priai class help create movement among the natives. And Made has mentioned a little bit before, it basically, the priai would turn against the Dutch, and then we started to see movement toward destroying the Dutch rule. So essentially, the ethical policy made a condition of possibility for resistance to be possible.
Made.
Yeah, I think Anna is right. But let me put it this way: the ethical policy is an effort to put the humanist face of the system, the capitalistic system, which is very, very exploitative, especially for the natives. But I can imagine if you live in that kind of in that era as a small peasant, and then you have nothing except you don't have your own land. It doesn't produce enough for you. So the only thing that you have is your physical. So you have to work, and then you go to the government asking for a job, and then become the coolie, indentured labor, coolie contract. That's what people here say. So that kind of thing it's under this system. You have to be migrated into other island, and in a very harsh environment, and it's very inhuman. Then some people in the Netherlands have a second thing. If you want to sustain this system, you have to humanize it. Yeah, you have to educate it. The mode of production, because I see that in Java there's still plenty of land, but there's no irrigations, no road. You have to build an infrastructure. You have to build schools. You have to improve the health. So you have a healthy people who can work, or there's a decent living, something like that. So put the human face on this kind of system. That's what they are hope for. This is I think the core idea of the ethical policy. Even though later on we will see that the consequences of this is huge for the society in the colony.
I also want to add that it was not the Dutch only that installed the ethical policy, which is unethical ethical policy, right? But also in French colony in Indochina, they also applied mission civilisatrice, which is civilization mission, and also in the British colonies, they have this idea of the white man's burden, right? Then they deliver education, etc.
I think I'm curious. It's probably the philosophy at that time across the people in Europe, a strand, because if you look at the religion, for example, the Catholic Church issued an encyclic, the huge debate about the system and socialism or capitalism and etc. So I think this is also part of the debates on the intellectual level in the Europe, and then it permeates into so many different agencies in the society. It goes to the religion, it goes to the economy, and it goes to the government policy.
So it seems like there's like intertwined debates in Europe about social welfare of the metropolitan working classes, and that's entwined with new liberal currents in colonial policy.
That's correct. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because that's become new moral at the time, probably. Yeah, I can guess, because everywhere we can see those changes.
Made, as you mentioned earlier, during this period, the colonial government began to turn away from the traditional aristocratic elite, the priai, and cultivated the power and influence of a group called the lesser or new priai as part of building this modern colonial administrative bureaucracy. And this class, as you mentioned earlier, it became a really key layer of leadership that would guide much of modern Indonesian politics, that would lead the country through independence and the various murderous conflicts that emerged in its wake. But before we get to the birth of modern Indonesian politics that start to cohere over these decades, nationalism, communism, Islamism, lay out this new social layer created by the Dutch colonial government. Who were these lesser priai? What sort of roles did they assume, and how did their emergence change or challenge the existing Indonesian power structure?
Yeah, at that time, this is the bottoms. These people are the bottom class of the rulers. They are not very influential, actually, at the courts. Yeah, but they are the bureaucrats. For example, the Wedana, which is in the sub-district level, and the Bupatis, the district level. The Bupati has some independence, but after the collapse of the kingdom or the court, the Javanese court, they become much more embedded into the colonial bureaucracy, doing a simple task. And then besides the Bupati, the Dutch put a controller in order to control all these people. As his name suggests, is a controller. And in the sub-district, they put the sub-controller. So that kind of things. And then I think as the bureaucracy becomes bigger, the modern state that the Dutch installed has become more complicated. They need manpower to run this. So that not so many Dutch people can handle this. So they employ this kind of people. And of course, they have to know what the Dutch is going. So they need the education. They are the first educated class. And this, I think, most of them is coming from the probably distant cousins of the sultans. of, for example, in Jogja, in Yogyakarta, there's a Pakualaman, distant cousins of Pakualam become educated. A guy named Suwardi Suryaningrat, and later on he dropped his his status as an aristocracy and adopted a new name, Ki Hajar Dewantoro. It's a lot of cases, there's a lot of cases like this one, and also inside the court, there's a kiai or religious figure, religious teachers actually, but they then help the Dutch and being educated in the Dutch systems and become, some of them are like Cokroaminoto, for example, mix the traditional religious education with the Dutch education system, and then working for the Dutch, and become basically they are intermediaries between the subject, that's the natives, and the Dutch. So they have a huge role. I think I can compare this. I think I can compare. I forgot one of the Slovakian intellectuals who wrote about nationalism. I think that's an intermediary. He mentioned the intermediary class, which strangely coming from the shoemaker. the intellectuals that come from this kind of social segment because of education. So it's again, I think the key is that education and the birth of modern bureaucracy, the need for the bureaucrats, but the education not only create bureaucrats, but also because these people are also, some of them are very smart, and it's become it paved a way for intellectual freedom. They read books and everything, and they got inspiration from books, and they also speak different languages. Some of them speak not only Dutch but also French and English and this kind of thing. So they are becoming the future of what we then call it Indonesia, and probably the term Indonesia also. They got it from their reading of text somewhere, and then they adopted.
Right. So just to add to what Mada has explained, there was at the time about 98%. That's what Ben Anderson said. 98% of all colonial employees were actually natives by 1930s. So the Dutch colonial government otherwise could not staff its own government. And then, so about the intermediaries, this is similar to the Chinese intermediaries, right? In which that this new priai class, the lesser priai, were given some kind of limited power, but they became the face of colonialism among the ordinary natives, that these ordinary natives despised them, right? So they started to realize that they have this limited power. And this is how that then, because they were educated, they're literate, they became early carriers of Indonesian national consciousness. So a lot of journalists, Indonesian journalists, nationalists, reformers, they came from this background. And Mada has mentioned some of them.
That was episode 1 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia, with Rianne Subijanto and Mada Supriatma. Stay tuned for episode 2, coming soon. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media, indoprogress.com. Mada Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review us positively. Truly, those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you spreading the word to your friends. Please make propaganda for us. And please do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.